It's widely understood that the NES is one of the most influential consoles to ever be released, and is home to a lot of what people would consider to be classics, and everybody knows what they are. Mario 3, Mega Man 2, DuckTales, Castlevania, Ninja Gaiden. But what about the lesser talked about games? Plenty of games were good enough to be classics in their own right, but just never got the same amount of buzz. Today, let's take a look at some pretty, in my opinion, underrated NES games.
Felix the Cat is a pretty old character, predating even Mickey Mouse by almost a decade. Premiering in 1919, he's now a century old, and over the past 100 years, he's been in various forms of media, including a couple TV series, one of which ran around the mid-90s. I'm not sure why they decided to start pushing Felix so hard in the 90s specifically, but this push also included his own video game for the NES in 1992. This was one of my favorite games growing up, and it's still pretty high up there, especially when looking specifically at the NES library. The closest thing I could possibly compare this game to is Kirby. Not necessarily in mechanics or anything, but in terms of how they approach difficulty. Felix the Cat is honestly very easy, and extra lives are practically thrown at you. Like Kirby though, the low difficulty of the game doesn't make it any less enjoyable. Just like the Kirby series, it's a perfect entry point for the 2D platforming genre. So there's 25 stages split up into 9 worlds, each containing traditional platforming stages, flying stages, and sometimes underwater stages with a boss at the end of each world. The main mechanic of the game that sets it apart is the tiered power-up system. Each stage is littered with these Felix medals, and collecting 10 of them will earn you a heart, which then transforms Felix. Each heart earned transforms Felix into the next in the tier, which increases his damage output and alters his attack. Getting hit, however, reverts you to the previous tier. There's also a limited amount of time you can stay in each form, but if you manage to keep collecting Felix medals, you'll earn milk bottles, which will extend the time you have. It's a pretty fun and forgiving system that rewards you for being thorough. Depending on the type of stage, the different forms Felix takes will vary as well. The music is really good and mostly upbeat and fits perfectly with the tone of the game, only starting to get more dire sounding during boss fights or endgame levels. This is a great game that I can't recommend enough, and I honestly think anyone who likes platformers, and especially if you like Kirby, should try this game out. There's also a Game Boy port as well. A lot of companies have tried to copy Pac-Man in one way or another. And I mean, who could blame them, really? It's a tried and true formula, a simple but addicting concept. Good enough to keep players pumping in quarters, but also not complicated enough for other companies to not be able to replicate its draw with similar games. Calling Midway's Trog a Pac-Man clone, I think, is being a bit unfair. I mean, it has a similar concept: walk around the map, collecting objects scattered throughout, and occasionally picking up a power-up that lets you eat the enemies you spend most of your time trying to avoid. Trog clearly has a lot of Pac-Man influence, as well as Miss Pac-Man influence when looking at how stage layouts vary. But it does a ton of original stuff that really do make it its own thing, and I think it's a pretty fun arcade game in its own right. And it had a port for the NES. As I'm sure you can already tell, you're a little dinosaur who has to walk around collecting eggs while avoiding the enemy cavemen known as the Trog. Unlike Pac-Man though, you can attack the enemies by punching them. This doesn't always work out in your favor, but it is a viable way of defending yourself if you're backed into a corner. There are also various power-ups that spawn as well. A red flower that makes the player speed up, ice cubes that temporarily freeze the Trogs, a fire power-up that lets you spit fire, and of course, the pineapples that make you turn into a T-Rex to chow down on enemies. There's also a mushroom that can randomly spawn as well, which, if picked up, slows the player down. There's also 3 difficulty modes to choose from, but I kinda suck at games like this, and I never played on the higher difficulties. Also unlike Pac-Man is the fact that each new area starts incorporating new mechanics to switch up the gameplay, like doors that warp you to different areas of the stage, and new enemy types with different attacks or types of movement. Trog is a really good NES arcade port that I never really hear many people talk about, and if you like games like Pac-Man, Trog will be right up your alley. Totally Rad is a game I don't hear almost anyone talk about ever, and when I do, it's usually negative. However, I think this game is mostly misunderstood, and I think it has a lot to offer. It's not the best 2D platformer on the NES, but it's totally decent. Now, originally, this game wasn't called Totally Rad, but when it was localized for the US market, they changed the story, characters, and title around to be hip to the radical lingo of 90s America, I guess. So I think the problem most people have with this game is that on the surface, it kind of looks like a Mega Man clone. Blue guy running around through a stage plowing through enemies by shooting stuff from his hand, a shot that can also be charged. In concept, yeah, this game operates a lot like how Mega Man does. Problem is, it controls literally nothing at all like Mega Man. The physics couldn't be more different if they tried. On top of that, your shot can't be charged while jumping, and you also can't use your charged shot while jumping. Instead of collecting power-ups from bosses, Totally Rad gives you a list of different magic powers that can be used from the beginning of the game. Some are attacks that can clear the screen of enemies, some are health with regeneration spells, invincibility, or time-stopping spells, but the main mechanic of the game is the different transformations. The transformations not only change up your attack, but can also give you different movement abilities, like the flying ability that I use to cheese the first level 100% of the time that I play this game. The bosses are also pretty interesting and require more skill than just standing around tapping the B button. Totally Rad is a lot slower than Mega Man, but I honestly think it's a lot of fun and deserves more of a chance than I've seen people give it. Tiny Toon Adventures is admittedly not an amazing game by any stretch of the imagination, but it is a competent little platformer that I think for the most part goes unacknowledged. If you've played any of the Tiny Toons games, you're probably familiar with this setup. You play as Buster Bunny and pick one of 3 partners to go through each level with. Each character has their own unique powers that can help in various platforming stages by finding a star power-up in a level which allows you to switch characters. Plucky Duck can hover in the air and swim a bit better. Dizzy Devil has his trademark spin, which can be used to plow through enemies and breakable blocks, and Furball can climb walls. Each individual character may be better suited to join you depending on the stage you're up against, but it's not required to pick any specific partner to get through a level. What we have here is your typical side-scrolling platformer from this era. The stages are relatively fun to traverse, albeit a bit frustrating in some parts, and bosses are simple to fight but do require some good reflexes. The inclusion of different mechanics by way of the partners does switch up the gameplay enough to keep things interesting, as well as the different level assets and locations. Don't get me wrong, this game really isn't anything to write home about, but I definitely think it deserves a little more praise than it typically gets. It even has a direct sequel too, so maybe the issues I have with this one were actually ironed out. At worst, it's unremarkable and a bit frustrating, but at best, it's a decent little NES platformer that should scratch an itch if you're looking for something to play that you haven't tried before. Little Nemo, the Dream Master is a really weird game. It was based on a 1989 animated Japanese film called Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland, which itself was based on an American comic strip that ran from 1905 to 1927. A pretty strange place to pull from for inspiration for a video game, but I guess back in 1990, everyone was just kind of throwing stuff at the wall to see what would stick. Developed by Capcom, it's not really a surprise that it's a pretty good 2D platformer. Capcom definitely knew what they were doing back then, and more often than not, if a game had their logo on it, there was a pretty high chance it was at the very least decent. Little Nemo, the Dream Master, follows the protagonist Nemo as he treks his way through Slumberland to fulfill an arranged playdate with the Princess of Slumberland. This is easier said than done, though, as pretty much everything with a pulse wants to take him out. The princess gives Nemo special candy that can pacify some of these creatures, which will then in turn either give him a ride or do this. Like in most 2D platformers, the object is to get to the end of each stage, but in the case of Little Nemo, not before collecting all the keys scattered throughout each level. The end of each stage has a locked door that requires multiple keys to open, and if you haven't collected them all by the end of the stage, you'll have to backtrack to pick up what you missed. The stages are all really colorful and imaginative, which I guess is unsurprising since this game takes place in a dream. The music is also extremely good and catchy. I've loved the music in this game since I was a kid. Actually, if you've been watching my channel for a while, the game's intro music has been playing during the end card of almost every video I've put out for a while now. Little Nemo gets extremely difficult really fast, but I definitely think it's worth a try. If nothing else, it's very unique. Enough to at least see what it's about. Most NES fans know that Bubble Bobble had a great port for the NES. I've played both the arcade version and the NES version, and in my opinion at least, there's no hit in quality between the two. The gameplay is spot on, the music is great, and it's all around a good time, and lots of people know it. It's easily a classic in the NES library. What I don't often hear people talk about, though, are its 2 sequels, Bubble Bobble Part 2 and Rainbow Islands, the story of Bubble Bobble 2. Today, we'll be talking about the latter. And if those naming schemes weren't already convoluted enough, there's also a sequel to Rainbow Islands as well, but I won't get into that today. I was first exposed to Rainbow Islands via a remastered collection for the PC, which also came out on the PS1 and Sega Saturn. As a kid, I loved Rainbow Islands, but I had no one to talk about it ever with because I never once heard anyone else say they knew what it was. The gameplay is definitely similar to Bubble Bobble, but it's also completely its own thing. Unlike the bubbles of Bubble Bobble, in Rainbow Islands, you create mini rainbows by pressing the attack button. These rainbows serve 2 purposes. They're used to attack enemies, but also used as platforms to gradually make your way up each level. I actually spend way more time platforming on the rainbows I create rather than the actual stage's platforms. Now, the music isn't as good as Bubble Bobble, so the repetitive nature is a bit more noticeable, but I actually find Rainbow Islands to be the more fun game of the two. There's way more variation in level design and feels much less arcadey in comparison. It's hard to describe what I mean. It may have something to do with the fact that each level is a level as opposed to each stage just being one single screen, but it feels more like I'm working towards a goal as opposed to Bubble Bobble's levels sometimes feeling endless like Pac-Man. There's also bosses at the end of each world, which pose a pretty good challenge. The NES version of Rainbow Islands is definitely stripped down in comparison to its other ports, especially visually, but it's still absolutely fun and a competent version that's worth checking out. And that's all the games I've got for today. There's a few more I thought of that didn't make it on the list, but maybe I'll revisit this topic in the future. The NES library is so vast that I'm sure I haven't scratched the surface even with the other games I had in mind. So if you know of any that you think are totally underrated and don't get enough recognition, feel free to comment them below. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can check out. And if you want to subscribe and see everything I upload, tap the subscribe button and also the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, I also have a Patreon right there too.